1981 was a pretty screwed up year. Of course, there was a silver lining, because 52 hostages in Iran were released after 444 days. Ronald Reagan got sworn in as president, only for 2 months later somebody tried to take him out, but it did nothing but solidify his presence, where he had a hardened, almost mythical image that resonated with some and, of course, repelled a lot of other people. NASA launched the Space Shuttle Columbia, pretty much making them the OG of true space travel. Musicians, fans, and potheads all over the world mourned the loss of Bob Marley, who really was probably the biggest cultural icon of all times. Kim Carnes' raspy vocals on Betty Davis' Eyes became a music staple all over the country. Jesse's Girl by Rick Springfield was essentially a stalker's anthem, but since it came out then, it was totally fine. If it were to come out today, it'd be a different story, as both Jesse and his girl would probably have a restraining order out against Rick. And Lionel Richie and Diana Ross got to sing Endless Love, and millions were smitten with the marriage of Princess Di and Charles, an event that predated the Kardashians. Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. MTV hit the scene in a big way, kicking off with Video Killed the Radio Star by the Buggles, and somehow finding a way to make Spandau Ballet an actual household name. But, however, some great rock bands from Motley Crue to Def Leppard to Priest to Van Halen were able to take advantage of the medium and take their careers to a whole other level. But 1981 was definitely a relatively weird year, but not so much in the world of rock and metal, as there were 10 albums, definitely a lot more than 10, but 10 that we would cover here, that absolutely kicked ass from start to finish.
Like, subscribe, thank you.
Number 10, Whitesnake, Come and Get It. Coming off probably the best early Whitesnake album, Ready and Willing. Whitesnake hit the scene with a brand new kind of semi-polished sound, but not so polished that they actually lost their element. If anything, this was the quintessential old Whitesnake album. This is their pre-cock rock days, even though they recorded at Startling Studios in Tittenhurst Park. But this place was actually owned by none other than John Lennon himself. But the band was kind of going through some stuff. Coverdale's ego was starting to get the best of him, and all the band members were really starting to feel as if they were playing second fiddle. But Ian Pace really brought a nice Bonham vibe to the album. Neil Murray's bass grooves were unreal. It would have been interesting to hear how he would have sounded if he were in Van Halen. Such an underrated talent for sure. And then he had that wicked guitar team of Mickey Moody, who was a real slide dynamo and really had his hands on the blues, while Bernie Marsden was able to sing really well, so he covered a lot of those harmonies, but he also brought a real fiery guitar playing to the group. But this all set the stage for David Coverdale to keep on modernizing rock with that cutting-edge voice that he has. He could go from Paul Rodgers to Plant in a split second, and vocally his chops actually exceeded them both. They brought in Martin Birch to produce it. Martin, of course, was going to be very busy that year, producing lots of stuff, as is his counterpart, John Mutt Lange. But what's cool about this album is that it had that signature old Whitesnake sound, but with a little bit more of a modern sheen. And they also had a fairly breakout hit with Don't Break My Heart Again, which was really driven by John Lord's excellent organ work. John Lord, of course, was in Deep Purple and played alongside Coverdale in that group, and he did quite a long run with the old Whitesnake as well. And really, he was actually quite elemental in shaping their sound from early on. Plus, he made organ look cool in the realm of rock. But Don't Break My Heart Again had a really catchy chorus and melody with this really cool kind of thumping bass line that just kind of drove it along. And Bernie Marsden and Mickey Moody were trading licks that were just full of attitude all over it. Another real standout track on this one is Wine, Women, and Song. It was really barroom blues. Think of it as almost like a sped-up Roadhouse blues or something. But of course with a lot more vocal range and some really cool changes with rollicking piano fills and infectious energy. You could tell me it's wrong, but I love Wine, Women, and Song. Felt like Party in a song form. Loose, loud, and carefree. Till the Day I Die is an epic arrangement starting with some sweet southern twinge guitars. Coverdale was lyrically heavy, and it's a far cry from some of their more well-known horny tunes. This one's deep. On the previous album they did Ain't Gonna Cry No More, which is another total standout from the early Whitesnake catalog. But in terms of this epic arrangement, Till the Day I Die is almost like a logical continuation. Later on, they'd continue with Love Ain't No Stranger, Judgment Day, and Sailing Ships, which would continue this sort of vibe that sits like a centerpiece on each album, even though the last two were actually both on Slip of the Tongue. But anybody who knows Steve Vai knows that he knows how to put something epic together for sure. Come and Get It was commercially successful. It went number 2 on the UK albums chart. And it didn't catapult the band into superstardom, but it definitely sort of set the stage for some of their later more polished work, where they would end up breaking through with Slide It In. But this one definitely laid some good groundwork. Number 9, Too Fast for Love by Motley Crue. An absolutely raunchy, sleazy as hell album that hit the scene just at the right time. Vince Neil screamed like a banshee, sounding a bit like a cross between a rock singer and a chipmunk with a rubber band tied around his balls. But you had Tommy Lee, where he still wasn't hidden behind production, because this was more of a raw and gritty thing. And so you could really hear those drums and just how they resonated. And of course, he wasn't shy with the cowbell. So if anybody ever wanted more cowbell, this is definitely a great album for those people with ears tuned to wanting to hear that cowbell. Nikki Sixx locked in. He was pretty much buried kind of down in the mix, but that's okay because Mick Mars really was able to completely shine on this one. So much so, as a matter of fact, that this album is evidence that Mick Mars is truly one of the more underrated guitar players of our day. And of course, we gotta consider, Motley Crue wasn't exactly a well-oiled machine. They're like a gang with instruments, with barely enough money to scrape together even studio time at that point. Mick Mars was packing his signature Les Paul, running it through Marshall stacks, which gave that guitar that really nice, gritty tone, which just perfectly fit on this album. And his playing was not at all restrained, but it was just so well put together. His licks and riffs were deceptively simple, which basically means that underneath they were actually very complex, but to the listener's ear, they just pop. One of the biggest highlights is the song Piece of Your Action. The whole band drives hard on this one. Vince Neil really explores his vocal range, but it is that guitar solo that Mick Mars lays down, which is arguably one of the best guitar solos in early rock. It is a song within a song. Mick Mars actually used a slide bar to pull it off, which is also interesting. A lot of people mistook that for the whammy bar, but no, he wasn't using a whammy bar. But it didn't sound like blues slide because he had that guttural distortion, and he was able to go ahead and rock those double stops and just send them flying up. And he also took advantage of a lot of chromaticism, because basically the entire riff was pretty much chromatic underneath his playing. But he built it up and built it up and built it up, and then all of a sudden the band goes into these really tight stops before Neil just lets out this extremely high-pitched scream. And that pretty much became the definition of the sound of 80s hard rock and metal right there. The album kicked off with Livewire, which is just fast, aggressive, and loud from start to finish. And of course, Tommy got in some pretty tasty cowbell in there. Same with Public Enemy number 1. The cowbell reared its ugly head again, but it was really unapologetically catchy and definitely an anthem, as well as the title track, Too Fast for Love. It's got a little bit of that pop sensibility mixed in, along with the grit, and this would sort of set the stage for a lot more of their glammier work that they would feature in their later stuff. So Too Fast for Love ended up being kind of a sleeper. It was a cult classic almost overnight. However, it had to get a slightly cleaner remix in 1982 for it to really take off. They had originally released it on their own label, Leather Records, but then Elektra Records came in and swooped them up, and the rest was history. Number 8, Def Leppard, High and Dry. This was when the band was still raw, but at the same time, they had just enough polish to sound really awesome. This album really was quintessential Def Leppard before they started popping it up, even though their next album, Pyromania, would also be pretty strong. But High and Dry wasn't just an album. It really was a coming of age for this band. These young guys from Sheffield, England were really starting to find their sound, but the biggest thing about it was that they had brought in Robert John Mutt Lang aboard. And he was the other producer I would mention that would just be very busy this year. Now, Lang had already transformed ACDC with Highway to Hell and Back in Black, and he really took this kind of meticulous, almost obsessive approach to production. Def Leppard had a pretty awesome dual guitar team with Steve Clark and Pete Willis, slinging some Les Pauls and Fender Strats through Marshall stacks. But the thing about Lang's production style is that he was really big on multi-layered guitars, and coming up with these epic vocal harmonies. Joe Elliott was by many's opinion not really the strongest singer in rock, but when Lang got a hold of him, he was able to go ahead and layer those vocals similar to the way Queen would layer Freddie Mercury's vocals. Starting out with Let It Go, they just hit hard immediately, right from the gate. Clark and Willis's riffs were really sharp and aggressive, and these guys, all in all, had an all-out command of the 4/4 groove. A really strong track from this one was High and Dry, Saturday Night. It was really prototypical of their sound to come on Pyromania. It's an ode to weekend partying, and Joe Elliott really gave it a good vocal delivery as well. But those riffs were just strong, along with Rick Allen's beat. It's pretty much a song you just kind of have to crank up and let it rip. And of course, the biggest hit off of this album, Bringing on the Heartbreak, predated songs like Love Bites later on. It's a total power ballad with a capital P, mixing that all-out emotion with big arena-ready choruses. And this song wasn't just a fan favorite. It also became one of Def Leppard's most iconic songs all around. And in 1984, it would be revitalized again as a hit on MTV. And that helped continue to propel them into superstardom. When it was initially released, the album wasn't a huge hit, but it would be a slow grower for sure. And it really helped pave the way for the huge success that they would get on their next album, Pyromania. And following that album, of course, would be Hysteria, which would be their biggest hit, but by that time they had kind of lost their rock flair and sounded much more synthesizer-driven in a lot of ways. Didn't help, of course, that Rick would end up losing his arm in a car accident, and so they'd have to come up with a lot of triggered samples. But still, it worked, and it resonated with the audience, so you can't complain there. But High and Dry, even though it flew under the radar a bit, was actually a really huge leap forward for the group. Number 7, Black Sabbath, The Mob Rules. Dio really came into his own vocally with this group on this album. It kind of combines the old Doom sound with that much more heavy-hitting metal that was occurring during this time frame. They were much faster and sharper, more theatrical. So this lineup had Ronnie James Dio on the vocals, Tony Iommi on the guitar, Geezer Butler on the bass, and they had brought in Vinny Appice on the drums, who replaced Bill Ward. And Vinny is just powerful as hell and full of drum chops. And that actually really propelled the band's sound. However, the new lineup wasn't without its struggle, especially between Dio and Butler, who were basically two Type A personalities that clashed on a lot of different things musically. But interestingly enough, that tension actually came out on this album. It was recorded at the Record Plant Studios in LA, and it was produced by Martin Birch, who had done the Whitesnake album. And of course, he had also worked with Iron Maiden and Deep Purple. But Birch had that talent of bringing out the live sound of a band and putting it on tape. So yes, you would have the overdubs and things like that, but it always just had this natural feel, and that was a staple of Martin Birch's production. Standouts include The Mob Rules, which is the title track, and this song is just relentless through and through. Vinny's drum beat really laid down a powerful foundation, and the thing about Ronnie James Dio's vocals is that they were both fierce and commanding. It's like a really good actor that just always takes over the screen anytime they're in a movie. That's kind of how Ronnie James Dio's singing was. And this one actually made it onto the animated film called Heavy Metal. Pretty damn cool, if anybody could say so. Another standout track, Sign of the Southern Cross. Absolute classic Dio-era Sabbath right here. It has kind of a mystical feel, but also really epic and really dark. Starting off with that haunting acoustic intro that leads into that slow, heavy riff. Tony Iommi plays this really cool, melodic, yet kind of restrained solo. It is just a great song, simmering all the way through. Also Voodoo, which is much more dark and gritty. There's a lot of tension in this song and a lot of kind of a hypnotic vibe to it. It's a real standout in Sabbath's catalog overall. And the album really initially didn't do as well as Heaven and Hell, or actually even overall. But in terms of this era of Black Sabbath kind of hitting its quintessential sound, The Mob Rules really stands out as one in their catalog. It was a really good snapshot in time before internal conflicts would eventually cause enough friction that Dio would be out, but it also really set the stage for some of his later solo work as well. Number 6, Iron Maiden, Killers. This album was definitely a landmark. It was also the last to feature vocalist Paul Di'Anno, who sadly would pass away in 2024. But with this one, Iron Maiden definitely took more of a darker, grittier approach, and their sound was really sharpened by this time. They had Paul Di'Anno on vocals, Steve Harris on bass, Dave Murray, and then they brought in Adrian Smith as well. and then they had Clive Burr on the drums. And Adrian Smith actually brought a new dimension to the sound. He had a lot of melodic flair and complexity that he would add to that twin guitar attack. But unfortunately, Paul was really heavily drinking, living hard and rough, and eventually he wouldn't be able to continue with the group. But this album definitely captured him at his peak, giving fans a final taste of that rougher, streetwise edge that he brought to the group. And again, we brought in Martin Birch as the producer. And he really brought out Steve Harris's bass, which was a defining feature of Maiden's sound. Front and center, nice and complex, with those galloping lines that drive each song forward. And of course, you had that dual guitar attack of Murray and Smith, which is a perfect pairing. Lots of really cool harmonized leads throughout and intricate solos that would become their signature as well. Some standout tracks, of course, Wrathchild. That was one of those riffs that budding guitar students would just have to learn. And it's a perfect showcase of Harris's bass skills. Totally recognizable right from that opening bass riff. And Paul Di'Anno's vocals are just gritty and full of attitude all over it. Has a nice anthemic chorus to it. And Murray and Smith's guitar work is tight and aggressive with a solo that just slices right through the mix. The title track, Killers, it's probably the most haunting song on the album. Has that slow, ominous bass line starting it out, gradually building into a full-on assault. Di'Anno's vocals in this one are sinister, almost unhinged, perfectly fitting with the song's narrative about a serial killer. Lots of tension and drama with the dual guitars, intricate riffage, harmonized leads, all with this kind of dark, foreboding tone. One of the faster, more frenetic songs, Purgatory, really showcases Maiden's early speed metal-ish side. The band became known for those catchy, galloping rhythms, and the guitar harmonies give it almost that uplifting quality, despite the dark lyrics. Murray's solo here is a real standout, delivering those rapid-fire notes that build up the song's intensity. Purgatory actually became a fan favorite, representing the more high-energy side of the band's sound. And Killers helped solidify Iron Maiden's place in the new wave of British heavy metal. And while it wouldn't really be as commercially successful as later albums, it was definitely a critical and fan favorite over time. And it did well in the UK, reaching number 12 on the charts. But unfortunately, brewing issues with Di'Anno meant that Maiden would soon be on the lookout for a new singer, where they would bring in Bruce Dickinson, whose operatic style would transform their sound and take them yet to new heights. But this one does remain a really good chapter in Maiden's history, capturing that unpolished energy that would never quite be replicated once Dickinson took over. And of course, the loss of Paul this year really left the metal world reeling. He was one of the true pioneers of metal and will be dearly missed for sure. Number 5, Van Halen, Fair Warning. This one is seen as Van Halen's darkest, most aggressive effort. Unlike the fun party vibe of the earlier records, Fair Warning definitely has more heavy and raw undercurrents. And the album also captured that friction within the group that was building between Eddie and David Lee Roth, especially. But the band was able to channel it into the music, proving that they weren't just a band for keg parties and sunsets in California. They're actually serious musicians who could deliver some of the most inventive and intensive rock of their time. Kicking off with Mean Street, one of Eddie's most jaw-dropping moments. Right from the start, he's doing something that's completely otherworldly, using this percussive tapping technique that's less about shredding and more about creating this almost space-age rhythm. It's like he's using his guitar as a set of drums, tapping out a beat that grooves as hard as anything Alex Van Halen could lay down on the kit. And the intro alone sets the tone. He starts getting really heavy into the harmonics work. And throughout the album, Eddie's harmonics really stood out in a lot of his solos. But here is where it all crystallized. Finger taps, whammy bar dive bombs, creating this whole soundscape. And then all of a sudden, bam, the band launches in with this riff that just has attitude. Michael Anthony's bass and Alex's drumming provide this really solid backbone. And then Roth comes in, full of attitude, snarling and almost taunting, adding to that song's vibe. What's interesting about this album is that Eddie was feeling the itch to experiment. So this album gave him a chance to explore darker, more complex themes and sounds. It wasn't just about pop hooks and catchy riffs. Yes, they did have them on this album too, but he was also able to explore a lot of other areas of his musicality. Standout tracks, of course, Mean Street, which really is a guitar masterclass in and of itself. Another standout is Push Comes to Shove, which is Van Halen at a really tasty and understated vibe. David Lee Roth dropped all pretense and sang smooth over the chill groove, driven by Anthony's seriously grooving bass and Alex's almost disco beat. but Eddie's guitar went well into fusion territory after some sweet reggae-influenced verse parts. And this was a different Eddie Van Halen. Yes, he took advantage of his famous symmetrical patterns, followed by some seriously tasty melodic pentatonic licks, but it's decidedly more like how a top-notch session player would have approached it. Lots of restraint, yet some of the most brilliant licks to come out of his guitar at the same time. Unchained, of course, pretty much considered the quintessential classic off this album, has one of the heavier riffs that Eddie wrote during that period, almost chunky like a metal riff, but with that classic Van Halen feel that keeps it from getting too rigid. Alex's drumming is massive, pounding out a beat that's as infectious as it is heavy. The chorus is very catchy, with the whole band harmonizing on the word unchained. Little playful interplay between Roth and Ted in the studio. Come on, Dave, give me a break. Of course, this is Ted Templeman, the producer, who really knew how to get the best sound out of the group. Another standout, Dirty Movies, takes on that sleazy, bluesy approach with a slinky riff that's catchy as it is dark. And it's got a cool set of lyrics, too, painting that gritty picture of Hollywood's underbelly. Eddie's playing on it is tasty, and the whole band just grooves. And of course, they also had another quintessential hit off this one, So This Is Love, which digs back to that signature kind of fast swing sound that Van Halen had going on. It definitely brings a little bit of lightness to the album. Eddie's chord work in this one is a real standout, as well as the tasty rock blues solo, and it shows that that guy could phrase amazingly. Sadly, the album didn't really achieve the same commercial success as a lot of their other albums from this era, but more and more, it has definitely become a fan favorite. At the time, a lot of critics didn't quite know what to do with it because Van Halen were taking a bit of a detour in terms of their direction that they're going. But the thing about the album is that it proved that Eddie Van Halen wasn't just a flashy player. He was a full-on innovator, always pushing boundaries of what a guitar could do. It also showed that Van Halen, when they wanted to be, was much more than a party band. They were a force to be reckoned with, doing some of the most innovative rock of the time. Number 4, ACDC. For those about to rock, we salute you. And this was a massive follow-up to Back in Black, which is the album that really cemented AC/DC's place in rock history, especially considering that it was a near impossible comeback after losing the amazing Bon Scott as their frontman. But now Brian Johnson was comfortably snuggled into this lineup, and it showed that they weren't going anywhere. A lot of powerful riffs, and this record really aimed to match the intensity of Back in Black, but they're kind of going for a bit more of a grander, more anthemic tone. And while it didn't eclipse its predecessor, it definitely became a classic in its own right. But you got to figure, coming off the success of Back in Black, AC/DC was now like, okay, what do we do now? It was a very challenging recording process, because after all, the band had been worn out from relentless touring, pressures to produce yet another hit album, and with John Mutt Lange at the helm, of course, he worked the band to the bone, which also created some friction in the studio. But nevertheless, they pulled it off. And it showed AC/DC doubling down on that thick, punchy guitar tones that define their sound, with Angus and Malcolm running their SGs and Gretches through Marshall amps, cranked up with earth-shaking intensity. And overall, the feel of the album was slightly more polished than Back in Black, but not by much. It was pretty much a logical continuation. The title track, of course, being one of AC/DC's most iconic tunes, starting off with a really cool, slow-building riff on the high strings by Angus, something that he would continue on similarly with Thunderstruck years later. But the song's a tribute to rock fans and performers alike, with the chorus and its signature cannon blast becoming legendary. It also, of course, did very well on MTV with the video. This song was definitely made to be played in stadiums. Another standout, Let's Get It Up, with this kind of upbeat, almost celebratory feel. And the lyrics are classic AC/DC, full of innuendo and swagger. And Johnson's vocals are perfectly suited to the material, and it also became a minor hit. Then you got Evil Walks, which has that sinister riff that gives it a different feel compared to the more upbeat tracks on the album. Nice, gritty, intense vocals by Johnson. And Angus' solo here is a bit more on the restrained side, but really powerful, showing off his ability to create mood and atmosphere. Definitely one of the album's hidden gems for sure. And bam, it hit the Billboard 200 at number 1, really making it the first AC/DC album to reach the top of the US charts. It didn't sustain success as long as Back in Black, but nevertheless, it solidified AC/DC's status as a real stadium rock powerhouse. And really, it just captures AC/DC doing what they do best: loud, unapologetic rock that sticks in your bones and dares you to crank up the volume. Number 3, Judas Priest, Point of Entry. Alright folks, I will own up to it. I missed a major one back in the 1980 video by not covering British Steel. That album, of course, was nothing short of a metal classic, practically inventing the 80s metal blueprint. And what did I do? Not include it. So folks, lick your right hand to deliver a nice wet smack to my forehead. But okay, now we will move on. And so now that I've repented for that sin, let's jump into their follow-up, Point of Entry from 1981. Now here they took a different approach, one that left the fans divided. They're coming off the massive success of British Steel, and they could have easily doubled down on those thunderous anthem-heavy riffs, but then the band decided to take a bit of a left turn, going for a slightly more polished, a little bit more radio-friendly sound. So really, overall, the album didn't quite hit with the same ferocity as its predecessor. But again, this is Judas Priest we're talking about, so the band knew how to friggin' rock. They recorded this at Ibiza Studios in Spain, which is actually a decision that was a head-scratcher for some fans. They thought, well, maybe the nice sun-drenched surroundings mellowed the band out a bit because it's a bit warmer and less gritty, with more of a focus on melodic hooks. And a lot of people speculated that Priest was trying to capture the American market, and so they were going for a bit more of an accessible sound. But this set the stage for a bit more of a refined Judas Priest. For example, Heading Out to the Highway, an absolutely standout track from this album, and one of the few that truly captured that classic Judas Priest energy. Seriously, the song kicks ass. It's a road anthem through and through, with a driving beat and an infectious riff. And of course, Rob Halford's vocals are just powerful. If ever there's a singer with a range, Rob Halford definitely takes the cake. And this was one that was decidedly catchy, but it worked. And it's easy enough to say that they did hard rock pretty much better than anybody else in a lot of ways. We're talking pure hard rock. No kings and queens, no pretense, no unnecessary flash, just pure unadulterated hard rock and goodness. Another interesting standout track, Don't Go. It's got this kind of down and dirty, enough to put the stank face on anybody listening kind of groove. A lot of space. And this is something sort of unexpected from such a hard-rocking band. And of course, they did a very cool video featuring the band in a single room for the most part, a few lucky rabbits that managed to not get stepped on, Halford rocking his stash, definitely good times. Speaking of rockin', Hot Rockin' is unapologetically as fun as it sounds. Definitely not the heaviest track by any means, but another one of those that just gets you to want to groove along to it. The chorus is pure 80s arena rock, catchy, anthemic, showing that Priest could really bring the party vibe when they wanted to. Halford's vocals are a bit more playful on this one, and the guitars are tight and punchy throughout. So yeah, it may not satisfy the hardcore metalheads, but definitely perfect for cranking up and letting loose. So Point of Entry was met with some mixed reactions. Following up British Steel was really hard to do, and that's the reason why this album ranks the way it did, is because it is still classic Priest, no matter how you put it. And they really had a hard job cut out for them. And fans and critics were divided. Some liked the more accessible sound. A lot of people just saw it as a bit of a step down from the heaviness. Just didn't have the same impact. But it showed a different side of the group. They were willing to experiment and try to reach a broader audience, which is pretty interesting. You know, it's a really unique snapshot of the group exploring this new territory and trying to find their place in the rock world of the early 80s. Number 2, Ozzy Osbourne, Diary of a Madman. And this wasn't just another album for Ozzy. It was a follow-up to his debut solo masterpiece, Blizzard of Oz. Expectations were through the freaking roof. And of course, Ozzy's guitar prodigy, Randy Rhoads, was by his side, and he had a lot to say on the instrument as well. This would captured Ozzy and Randy and the entire group at their creative peak at that time, blending haunting melodies, dark themes, and jaw-dropping guitar work into a record that remains one of the most iconic in history. And of course, the band was going through some tensions. You had Bob Daisley and drummer Lee Kerslake being not credited on the album's original release due to conflicts with Ozzy's management, who really consisted of Sharon mainly. So instead in the credits, you would get Rudy Sarzo and Tommy Aldridge. Now already the band was kind of splintering though, when they hit the studio to do this one. Randy Rhoads was already getting a lot of attention for his unique style and technical brilliance, and he was kind of starting to get itchy feet and wanting to go off and do his own thing. Sadly, this would be his last work on an album, when his life was tragically cut short when he died in a plane crash the following year. But it would be Randy Rhoads' final studio album, and it would really show where he was going musically. His playing combined a sense of finesse of the classical music with the intensity of metal, creating a sound that was both powerful and haunting. He had his polka dot Sandoval V and Gibson Les Paul, which he would interchangeably use for the album, plugged into a cranked up Marshall stack, and his solos on the album were legendary, blending rapid fire runs with intricate phrasing, adding this layer of sophistication. The sophistication that you would hear on their earlier album, but Randy managed to really refine it for this one. And a lot of this is because by that time, they had been touring. He was able to really come into his own in the group. Starting off with Over the Mountain, the album opener is a classic, with thundering drums, starting off from Curse Lake, kicking things off with a bang. And Randy's riff is just fast and furious, and his solo is a tour de force, combining blistering speed with impeccable precision. Ozzy's signature doubled vocals really just sounded ominous and evil over the top of all the tracks on this one. And then they got Flying High Again, which is actually more of a fun, happy track, but nevertheless, you don't let that happy melody fool you. Rhodes' guitar work is intense. A real tour de force for Randy himself, though, was Diary of a Madman. The title track is really the album's crowning achievement. A really dark, complex composition, showcasing a lot of Rhodes' classical influences. And this most likely hinted at the direction musically that Randy would have gone, had it not have been for that tragic plane crash. The rhythms of the verses were syncopated in this really weird way, making the song kind of have almost that little jump in there, and it just added to the eeriness. Of course, you had the acoustic intro, which is just fully eerie and haunting, setting the stage for this song that's just introspective and explosive at the same time. And Ozzy's vocals on this one were just intense, capturing the feeling of descending into madness. Randy Rhodes' solo here is one of his best, combining the classical techniques with that emotional power. It's a fitting closer to the album, leaving listeners with a sense of awe and a hint of dread. And rightfully so, Diary of a Madman was definitely a commercial success. Went platinum, solidifying Ozzy's position as one of metal's top solo artists. Critics loved the album, especially the exceptional musicianship of Rhodes, who was hailed as one of the most exciting guitar players of the era. Fans were drawn to the album's dark themes and haunting soundscapes. Songs like Over the Mountain and Flying High Again really became staples of Ozzy's live performance. And of course, the album's forever tied to the legacy of Randy Rhodes, whose tragic death in 1982 shocked the rock world. And for Ozzy, it was solid proof that he could really stand on his own. But for Randy Rhodes, it was a showcase of what he could achieve in his all-too-brief career. Together, they created a piece of heavy metal history. Number 1, Rush, Moving Pictures. Like Judas Priest before, the old wet hand smacks me upon the forehead since I did not cover Permanent Waves in my 1980 video, but nevertheless, Moving Pictures is such a quintessential Rush album. By the time they dropped this one, Rush was already a staple in the prog rock scene, known for their complex compositions and philosophical lyrics. But Moving Pictures was something different. It was a pivotal album that streamlined their sound without sacrificing that technical showmanship or lyrical depth. It wasn't just a new era for this band. It really redefined what progressive rock could be in the 1980s, and it opened doors for them in ways that they had not even anticipated. Recorded at Le Studio in Morin Heights, Quebec, Moving Pictures was produced by Rush and Terry Brown, their longtime collaborator. And Le Studio, surrounded by the serene landscapes of the Laurentians, was a perfect setting for Rush to experiment and push those creative boundaries. Alex Lifeson's guitar work on this album is rich and versatile and much more polished than ever. He used that Gibson ES355 for much of the album, paired with high-watt Marshall amps, where he would alternate between atmospheric textures and driving riffs, providing that perfect backdrop for Geddy Lee's punchy bass lines and Neil Peart's intricate drumming. Neil Peart was just an all-out badass on the drum kit. Pretty much all through that period, he was the most feared drummer, simply because the guy played as if he had 8 arms. But Geddy Lee's synths also played a major role in the album, adding this depth and dimension to the music. And of course, with that impossible vocal range, those 3 guys were really able to put something together that was really special to music. Tom Sawyer, arguably one of Rush's most iconic songs, and really one of rock's most iconic songs all around. This one truly landed prog rock on the map like no other, kicking off with a synth riff that was instantly recognizable, leading into that powerful groove showcasing Peart's drumming wizardry. Lifeson's guitar solos on this one is just searing and perfectly placed, fully improvised. And Geddy Lee's vocals made it catchy in its own way, but not where it was trying to sound like an endemic hit. Instead, it was a real thinking piece, really dark, almost like from outer space. It was like science fiction in a song. Red Barchetta. Inspired by a dystopian short story, Red Barchetta tells that tale of a forbidden car ride through a future where cars were banned. Alex Lifeson has a lot of really cool open chords going on, and you got Neil Peart's lyrics building that vivid narrative, capturing the feeling of the high-speed chase with tempo changes and dynamic shifts, just keeps listeners on the edge. XYZ, an absolute Rush classic. It's an instrumental showcase of the band's technical skills all around. It was named after the Toronto Pearson International Airport Code, and the song actually begins with a rhythm that spells out XYZ in Morse code. That is geeking out and music at its best. And then the track, of course, explodes into this flurry of intricate bass, guitar, and drum parts. Everybody getting a chance to shine. Lifeson and Lee would just weave in and out of each other's lines, creating this complex, high-energy track that really has become a huge fan favorite. And of course, Limelight. And this actually lyrically offers a glimpse into Neil Peart's personal struggles with fame and the pressures of being in the spotlight. The lyrics are introspective, reflecting on the challenges of public life. Musically, it has more of a straightforward structure, making it one of the more accessible tracks on the album. But that guitar solo by Alex Lifeson is just such a standout as well. The way it starts off with him just sustaining the note and letting it slowly turn into natural feedback. When people talk about slow and tasty emotional playing, Limelight is definitely a great example of that through Alex Lifeson's work. And shout out to the Trailer Park Boys. Alex Lifeson actually played a part in that show too. Rick, Jules, and Bubbles, you know who you are. Moving Pictures was a massive commercial success. It hit number 3 on the Billboard, becoming Rush's best-selling album. And it was a huge turning point, bringing them mainstream recognition, especially with Tom Sawyer and Limelight, which just got a ton of radio play, and still to this day do. Moving Pictures also set a new standard, showing that technical proficiency and accessible songwriting could peacefully coexist, and has inspired countless bands in years to follow, from metal to alternative rock. With Moving Pictures, Rush didn't just record an album, they captured the sound of a band to their peak, blending the technical with the emotional, pushing rock in a bold new direction. So there you have it, folks. 1981 wasn't just another year in rock and metal. It was definitely a turning point in and of itself. From the gritty riffs of Fair Warning to the haunting darkness of Diary of a Madman, and everything in between, it proved that the genre was evolving, pushing boundaries and setting the stage for what was to come. Bands weren't just taking risks. Guitar players were rewriting the rule book. And rock wasn't just alive, it was unstoppable. And for those about to rock, this year definitely laid down the gauntlet. So to my subscribers, thank you so much for all the inspiration and feedback. I appreciate each and every single one of you. If you're new, smack that subscribe button. And while you're at it, smack that like button. And I want to thank you so much for joining the family.